Just tell us a bit about how did it all start out? Like, were you from a GA mod family, or what was it like growing up?
Yes, well, I suppose being from Clonduff, and when I was growing up, totally different times, but it was football mad. That's all that it's all probably was about, for a bit of escapism or whatever, Sean. My mother's family were steeped in the club here in Clonduff, and my father's family were from Warren Point. They were all involved with the GA in Warren Point, and would have had a long history with both Warren Point and with Down.
And did you, coming up, Ross, was it very much a case that you always wanted to play for Down, or was that just sort of an ambition that you sort of dealt with when it come, or how were you growing up?
When I was growing up, it was if you take the formative years out of it, Down had won the All-Ireland in 1968. When I was growing up at primary school, my principal in primary school was Kevin Musson, and Kevin had captained Down to the first All-Ireland in 1960. My mother taught in a primary school in the parish, and the principal of that primary school at the time was a Mrs. O'Neill, who was Sean and Kevin O'Neill's mother. And my earliest next door neighbour was the O'Hagan family, Patsy O'Hagan, who played for Down in 1960 and 61. So I don't think it was by design, but just the very fact that a lot of my early years I was surrounded by huge GA influences outside of the house, and then especially at home, where, as I said to you earlier, my mother and father's family were all involved in the GA. So I probably, without knowing it, it was no big surprise that I went on to have a huge interest in Gaelic games. Early in I think I was 11 or 12, the community games was a big event in our area, and I was part of a football team that went to Butlins. My father was a coach on that team, but one of the coaches was also the great Tom O'Hare, who won an All-Ireland medal with Down in 1968 and was from Neo Bridge. So from 6 or 7 onwards, I had huge influences around me, steering me down the GA path, and it was brilliant. I had an incredible childhood. We used to go to games, my mother would have taken me to games. Down were playing. The Railway Cup was a huge thing at the time. The Railway Cup finals were played on St Patrick's Day in Croke Park. Because Down had won in 1968, a lot of those players were playing for their clubs in the 70s and even into the mid-80s. You were going to games, you were going to club games just to get seeing the superstars, and it was fantastic.
And Ross, you'd mentioned them sort of All-Ireland winners in the 60s, and then you're coming in around the 80s. Where was Down football at that stage when you started? You were coming out of minors, under 21s, coming into the senior setup. Where was Down football at that stage when you first joined?
While there was a massive gap in senior success, Down had won a minor All-Ireland in 1975. It won the Ulster Championship in 1978, and the one had an All-Ireland, under 21 All-Ireland in 1979. So the Down Miners in 1977, which was managed by Sean O'Neill, they trained at Clonduff. I remember being down there 2-3 times a week, watching them training, just kicking balls back to them. I was probably 13 or 14 at the time. And then you were getting to trips in 1978. You were getting to Clonus, full house in Clonus, getting to All-Ireland semi-finals. So while they hadn't probably national success at senior level, there was still success to keep the interest going. I went to St Coleman's in Newry, which obviously had the brilliant Ray Morgan and Pete McGrath coaching their teams, along with other teachers who had huge influences on lads growing up. In 1980, Clonduff, my own club, won the championship and league, and I was coming 16, and I was called into that panel. So I'd always be serious influences and on my career, because while I was getting older, and maybe the county influences were being replaced with club influences. Great men who I started playing for, had played for Clonduff in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, right through to 2000s, played over 3 and 4 decades. They were incredible fellas to go into a changing room with, and to this day they would be held in serious high regard within the club. I suppose the natural course of events, as you were probably playing more, making a senior club debut, you were coming under the notice of representative teams. So there was a county under 16 team. In 1980, it was managed by Pete. I got on it. Then I was on the minor panel for a couple of years. And once you make the minor panel, if you're doing well enough, then you would be called into an under-21 panel. And if you're doing well enough, you're called into a senior panel. And without probably having a plan, you're in that environment. So you're probably doing the right things. You're training hard, you're practicing, you're all the probably wee cliche things, but without having I'm not saying it wasn't structured, but it wasn't written down and followed. But there was always a deep, deep desire to represent Down, not just because I had grown up with those influences, those county influences around me, but Down had won an All-Ireland as I said, in 1960. It was captained by a Clonduff man, Kevin Musson. Patsy O'Hagan played on it, another Clonduff man. One was my primary school principal, the other was next door neighbour. My uncle, my father's brother, managed that side, Barney Carr. But before that, in 1946, there was a Down team won a junior All-Ireland, the first ever All-Ireland. And another of my father's brothers captained that team, Jerry. And my father was on that panel of players. So I suppose I wanted to make sure that I was contributing to the DNA as such, because in 1977, when Down Miners won the All-Ireland, I had a cousin, Seamus, whose father had captained the 1946 team. He was on the minor team that won the All-Ireland. I suppose there was a wee bit of I better be able to hold my head up at family functions and and be able to say that I've won something too. But it was brilliant, Sean. Really, really brilliant.
It sort of sounds like you had no choice, or else you had to play for Down and you had to win things.
Sometimes you end up in those sorts of situations. You look back and you wonder, was it all mapped out for you? I don't know, but you can never say that. Like, I was incredibly lucky with injuries. I was incredibly lucky that an awful lot of people around me made huge sacrifices to allow me to do that, both when I was growing up, mother and father, but also I got married when I was young. My wife Teresa made huge sacrifices because we had 2 young kids when we were young, but the family circle chipped in and did everything they could to allow me to go to training, to do whatever was needed. And it was, I suppose, looking back now, you realise how lucky you were without maybe realising it at the time.
And in 91 then, Ross, that's sort of obviously the big year for Down. It's probably a bit of a roller coaster ride. I know that saying has been said loads of times when Armagh played down. Somebody said the pick of them two teams wouldn't win the All Ireland. So 91 it must have been just a complete roller coaster ride.
I suppose when if you take the starting point, the end of it, and you look back and you'd say, my God Almighty, how did that team ever win an All Ireland? Down had won a National League in 1983. And while that's 8 years beforehand, there's a number of those players still on the panel. They were beaten in an Ulster final in 1986. We were beaten narrowly in Ulster Championship semi-finals in 88 and 89. 1990 was a probably the worst of the years for Down. We were beaten in casement by Armagh, and maybe a lot of soul searching had to be done at that time. And I think maybe for the first time ever, it probably dawned on me that some serious soul searching and honest conversations had to take place, because once you get into an environment, habits can become good or bad. They can just become the norm without you actually really understanding or realising it. And if they're bad, it can be you take it for granted, and that's probably the worst thing you can ever do, is take something for granted and you become indifferent then to the consequences of anything. So I had a really bad year in 1990. I picked up an injury probably for the first time in my career, and I wasn't playing well. But at that time, if you'd been on the panel for a while, you were kept on it. And that's just the way it was. It's not why it was good, bad or indifferent. That's just the way it was. But then I lost my place for Down, and that was the first time that had happened since I joined the panel in 1983. That was some gunk. That was the first time the alarm bells started to, I suppose, to ring a wee bit. I come out of the panel for a while. I had a knee injury, needed surgery. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise, because things hadn't been going well for me in Clonduff either. I wasn't playing the football I should have been playing. Clonduff changed their manager, brought in Bank Dawson. He probably wasn't that well known, but he was like a breath of fresh air for us. I had sort of the body was a lot better and in better shape, and I was back playing, back enjoying things. And I suppose because I was playing well, I had a conversation with Pete and John Murphy. That at the end of the conversation, it was decided, did I want to play for Down? And of course I wanted to play for Down, but these were the conditions. And that was in mid-April, late April 1991. And it's hard to imagine what was going to unfold. You couldn't really have thought there was any chance of what was about to happen. Not because there wasn't the players, because in my opinion, we had some incredible footballers. And also too, in 1986 and 1987, while Down had been beaten in an Ulster senior final, in 86 and 87, they'd won back-to-back Ulster minor titles. So Conor Deegan's, Cathal Murray, Wee James, a number of those fellas were coming in off those panels. They were now like 20, 21. I honestly believed at that particular time we had three of the best forwards in Ireland. So you had Greg and Mickey and James. If one team has three of the best forwards, it's highly unlikely another team has three of the best defenders in the country. So I always felt that we had a chance. Like whether that would mean that you would end up winning, I don't know. But we always had a chance. And if we could only get things right together, because there's a serious amount of strong personalities in that group. And the key is I suppose the key with any group is to allow the strong personalities to flourish, but also understand that for them to be the best or to have the biggest influence on a game, everybody has to put in a shift. And for 5 or 6 months, that's what happened, and it ended up winning the All-Ireland, and it was an incredible summer.
And that summer, Ross, your frees obviously played a big part. Were you always a free taker, or how much time and effort and practice did you put into the frees?
Yeah, I was. From an early age, I was always hitting frees. If you go back to influences again, Sean O'Neill hit frees with Down, Paddy Doherty hit frees for Down. They were huge heroes. So as a child, you copy people who you idolise, and I was probably the second best free taker Down had at that particular time. Gary Mason was the best. He was serious. He was the best striker of a dead ball I have ever seen. And when we won the panel before, one of our managers was Sean Smith. Sean had a long, brilliant relationship with Sean. He was manager of Clonduff when I joined the senior panel in 1980. So I probably was coached by him from when I was 16 up until the late 80s, because if I needed advice on stuff, I would have phoned him and asked him, and he was a brilliant man. He used to have Gary Mason and I before training and after training competitions, and you didn't go in until there was a winner. Now, they didn't last hours or anything, but there was always competition, which meant that there was always a wee bit of pressure. Nothing like there would have been in match days, but we're talking now 35, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. So there was a lot of those things that you were taught early, and you just kept doing. Practice was huge at that particular time when Down were going well. I would have practiced daily, so I had moved to a job as a trainee accountant with another great man, John McMahon. He was originally from Cullyhanna, but his offices were up in Camla, outside of Newry, and it was straight across from St Paul's secondary school. So I would have used lunch times to practice on their pitch, and then because I was so close to Newry, I would have arrived at training maybe an hour before, around 6 o'clock or so, and would have been able to get practicing done then. And we were very lucky because the football pitch at home is only down the road from me. You were able to get a bag of balls from the club and head down to the pitch and just practice. There was no, I suppose I didn't have any, look at some of the clips of people practicing now, the great kickers now, they go through routines and that type of thing. I had a bit of a routine, but you kicked until you were confident enough to leave it. You kicked for hours until you felt you got it right. Now, looking back, you couldn't be getting it right after 2 hours or an hour and a half. But that's sometimes the lack of science and the naivety was as good as anything else. That was maybe made it as enjoyable as anything else.
And obviously we know how 91 ended, Ross. What was it like, the final whistle and the homecoming and just having followed the footsteps of your heroes, I suppose?
It was massive. That summer was very special for a lot of reasons, Sean. Like that group from the 1960s were brilliant to us. So even though it was new for that team to go into Croke Park in an All-Ireland final, nobody had experienced it before. The men from the 1960 teams, they had all, over the course of that year, well, probably as from the Ulster final onwards, had reached out and some of them were at training, some of them would have sent you messages, some of them would have spoken to you about, what it would be like, the atmosphere. As I said to you, I was incredibly lucky. Like, Kevin was my principal. Now, he had moved on at that stage, but he was on the end of a phone. Patsy O'Hagan was constantly in contact. Colin McAlarney, who was my hero. These people were just there. Leo Murphy, Peter Rooney. you would have met them, had a brief chat. Sometimes you could have met them for a cup of tea or whatever. They were just brilliant. So we didn't really have an awful lot of nerves going into it. There was expectation, and I suppose that brought a wee bit of pressure. But how would you? Sometimes to say pressure can stop you from performing. But sure, if you're playing in an All-Ireland final, what was there not to enjoy about the whole thing? After winning, it was funny because I've spoken to a couple of the boys with this. It was brilliant for us, don't get me wrong, but it was nearly more enjoyable seeing what it meant to so many others. That's hard to explain because it was nearly payback for a whole lot of people who had made sacrifices for all of us during the career. So the longer you go on a journey with a group of lads, you get to meet their wives, their girlfriends, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters. So we had a huge connection, and to this day, thank God, it's still there. It was nearly brilliant to see what it meant to the families of the players, and then obviously when we went back into our own clubs, like people, my next door neighbours, families from my own parish, who to this day, you maybe stop and have a chat with them and they talk about it, what it meant. And unfortunately, a lot of these conversations are happening in graveyards after Mass, where more and more people, that's where you head and meet them or that. But 91 was incredible, but it was incredible for the whole county. It was such a wave of emotion. And it was totally different than in 1994. Because while most of us were still there in 1994, the in-between years, so 92 and 93, didn't go well on the pitch. We were beaten narrowly by Derry in the Ulster semi-final of 1992, and then they beat us well in 93. So did a lot of soul searching, and at that stage a lot of the team that had been still playing together had been playing together for anywhere between 4, 5 and 10 years. So some lads were beginning to hit 30, into their early 30s. And had you had another bad year in 1994, it's quite possible that a lot of careers would have been over. So when we won that, I often find, while there was no difference in the enjoyment, one gave me more personal satisfaction than the other.
I was going to ask you about 94, Ross, because obviously it was such a great time for Down those couple of years, but obviously a great time for Ulster as well, sort of dominating the All-Ireland series. But that 94 one, it's nearly that old saying of, good teams win one and great teams win two. Was that sort of the feeling after 94?
I don't think so, Sean. No, I wouldn't say it was. We wanted to say we were greater, and it was more of a personal justification that the way, the structure is all different now. So once you were beaten, you were out. So you could lose a first round game by a last minute goal or last minute point, and you were never heard of, and nothing happened again until October. You could have gone well in the league. You could have been a Division 1 team playing well, but just come up against somebody on a day who was a wee bit better, and you lost by a point. But the championship defined the whole year, which meant that had you lost, you were, I suppose, then the media attention, not that it's as bad as it is now, but from within the county, if you lose that particular time, there was definitely an inquisition. So I wouldn't say it was to prove to everybody else that we had to win two to become great. Any team that wins in All-Ireland is a good team. And to end up winning is should it only be once, is a great thing. That's my opinion anyway. But the 94, the manner of the defeat, the previous year, 93, was difficult because we felt we were every bit as good as we were in 91. So, and nobody wants to hear excuses, but we had 92 in 93. We've come up against probably one of the best teams ever. So that 93 team of Derry have only won All Ireland. That Derry team. So in 1991, the team that beat Derry won the All Ireland. In 1992, the team that beat Derry won the All Ireland. In 1993, Derry won the All Ireland. In 1994, the team that beat Derry won the All Ireland. 1995, the team that beat Derry went on to the All Ireland final. So for 5 years, if Derry were beaten in the championship, the team that beat them went on to play in the All Ireland final.
Yeah.
They probably had 3 or 4 players who were the best players over the last 40 years and would get on any team in any era. So McKeever, Scullion, Henry Downey, Tohill, McGilligan, Enda Gormley, and they only won All Ireland. So I wouldn't say that if you only win one, you're not a good team, because that team to me was as good as any team that has won on All Ireland that I can remember, definitely from 85 onwards. So when we won in 1994, it was more, for me, I can only speak for myself, but for me, it was more of a personal justification that if everything's level and it's down to hard work and ability and people stay fit and all that, we were every bit as good as anybody else. And if we were given the chance, we could show that. 94 focused the minds early because we'd been beaten by Derry in 92, we'd been beaten by Derry in 93, and then we had to go to Derry in 94, and they were the All-Ireland champions. And given it was a knockout, if you didn't get over that, there was no second chances. So we had to probably peak for our first round championship game. And, by all accounts, people who were at it would say it was one of the best games they ever saw. Well, I was shite that day. I didn't have a great game that day, but I got better as the year went on. And it's funny, once we got to September, it was really hard to stay at the very, very top of the game for 5 months. We had done a serious amount of training from January onwards. We put in an incredible shift. Everybody put the shoulder to the wheel for the Derry game. That fitness carried us on into the Ulster final. And I would say the Ulster final against Tyrone is probably, over the 2 or 3 years that we were together, was probably our best performance. I don't think an all-star team would have beaten us that day. That's the day for me when everything clicked. That summer was a very emotive journey that year, Sean, because the Loughlin Island massacre happened that year. I'd made reference to Gary Mason before, and the day after we played, or the day before we played in the Ulster semi-final against Monaghan, that thing happened that night, and for anybody that was in a round down at the time, that'll stay with them forever. There was nearly, while it was never mentioned, and it was never mentioned because of how horrific it was, how devastating it was for people we knew. So some of the people who were murdered, we knew family members. Some played with Loughlin Island. We would have played against them, in our club teams. We were training with a fella who was from Loughlin Island, played for Loughlin Island, knew each and every one of those that were murdered. I suppose there was no conscious decision to speak about these things. How do you speak about something so awful, so horrendous? But I do think that there was a promise made, or that we would try and do our best to try and help those that maybe for an hour could take their minds off something, or take them out of a hell that was unimaginable for so many. 94 was a strange one. You were playing football, but it was the first time that you realised that there was some things far, far more important than football.
That game itself, Ross, like as you mentioned, did it feel like, you know, yes, you're going out to play a football game and you're trying to, you know, you said for that hour just to let people's minds rest, really. So, like, was it more than a game that day? Sort of the.
I don't know. I can hardly. The only thing I can remember, Sean, you know, you've got to remember there was the way you and I are communicating now. That wasn't. People didn't know about the extent of it, even when we were meeting the next day. So the match was in Armagh. We were meeting at 12 o'clock or whatever it was. People were coming out of masks at Hilltown, and you weren't sure still of all the details. It's not as if everything was at first hand. So there was still a lot of confusion and what way is Guy about. Literally, we didn't know. And because you were focused on a game for the next day, we didn't even know whether the game was going to go ahead or not until a couple of hours beforehand. And, you know, whatever decisions were made, and there isn't right or wrong. It was just, and looking back, I think it was the right thing to play the game because you have to go on. I don't know. I remember speaking to some of the families about it since, and they said they were so happy that Down had a summer because it just helped deflect from the horror. But that day in Armagh there was hardly a clap. There was hardly a. My memory of it is that could have been played on the top of a mountain. There was no atmosphere at it. There was no noise. It was uneery. It was a strange event.
And just on the rest of your career then, Ross, I know you finish up playing in around 2000 and you go straight into management then. You're involved with the minors and then into the seniors. Was that always something you envisioned yourself doing, going into that sort of coaching role and management role?
No, well, I suppose like anybody's career, once the good years end, you trickle off. And down in the late 90s, we were getting it tight. There was a couple of times how we got over the line in championship games. I felt we could have built momentum in that. But I was getting into my late 30s. I was 39 when I stopped with Down. But then in Clonduff, we had a very special group of young lads that had dominated the underage scene from they were young teenagers. They had won everything around them, and they were then starting to come into the senior team. I remember seeing them playing and thinking to myself, "Just boy, hang on here, try and stay as fit as you can, because if these boys come through, you could win a championship medal with them." And that's what happened. The man that I mentioned earlier in 1990 that came in, Frank Dawson, he came back in 2000. He just brought another wave of enthusiasm about the place, but he was fortunate in that we had a group of young lads that came about the place that were fearless, confident, so much ability, was frightening, had won so much at underage that nothing fazed them or that. So I sort of felt that if we could keep a handle on them, we could have a couple of great years. In 2000, Clonduff won the league and championship double, so that was just class. And at that stage, I was 40. Unfortunately, a couple of those young fellas went away. We didn't capitalise in the club. We didn't capitalise on their talent. And I think because they won so much so young, sometimes you can win at a young age, not having to work hard for it. But once you have to start working hard, finds you out. And we weren't able to sustain that. But in fairness, we were also coming up against a Mayo Bridge team. Mickey was still playing with and they had a crowd of young fellas who came along that were just very, very special as well. You know, Benny Coulter, Michael Walsh, Roman Sexton, young Barry. There was a squad of those lads came about the place, and Brenton Grant. They went on to dominate. But then my son Aidan was a late teenager at that stage, and I suppose I wanted to play a year with him. Once I was able to tick that box, I just felt that, yeah, that's enough. I was incredibly lucky and fortunate to have a playing career that allowed me to play for as long with so few injuries, and while the success was periodic, when it happened, it was incredible. So when I came into a panel at 16, you know, Clonduff won the league and championship, and a couple of years after, 20 years later, 25 years later, I was able to bow out, having had a right old trip at it. The coaching, I certainly didn't have any, late in my career, didn't have any thoughts, geez, I'd like to give this coaching a go. I think at that particular time, people thought that if you played football at a high level, I'm sure you can coach. And I got into it by default. I was asked to help out with a county under-21 squad, and I really enjoyed it. Then I got involved with a club team in Uri Mitchell's. It was class, because when I went and saw them first, met the people who were running the club, they just wanted, they loved Gaelic football, and they wanted to pass that love on to the next generation in Uri. And it was a fantastic couple of years. And there was a bit of success on it, which meant then that people would automatically think, well, Jesus, maybe you could help us out. Got involved with the county minors, and again was very lucky because I was with some great people, Mickey Doyle, Declan Musson, but you had some incredible footballers. You know, seeing young fellas at 17 and 18 and nearly getting there. And that's one thing coaching has taught me, is that you become more aware of what the journey gets you rather than just a one-off match, win or lose. I feel that in any coaching setup that I was involved in, we made players better. And my coaching career started with teams in intermediate or Division 3, and I had county minor teams, county under-21 teams, county senior teams, club senior teams. Was able to coach in other counties, and the last coaching job that I was involved with was our down in Belfast, our down Kickham's, and that was just the greatest experience I've ever had in Gaelic games, because I went into a community that I knew very little about in terms of the GA influence. I met three fellas who asked me would I come in. Jim O'Macaulay, Conor McGee and Conor Madole. By the time I'd left, I actually thought I was maybe going to be coaching Dublin seniors. They spoke that highly of the players that they had, about the size they were, about the athleticism that they had, the natural ability they had. I should have known that they're cute boys, those fellas from North Belfast, or as they call it, the district. But Sean, it was, if anybody gets involved in coaching, if they could only have a wee bit of the 3 years that I had in our down, they would stay in coaching forever, because that was the most special group of people, not just players, but people that I ever came across. And we have incredible people in Clonduff. Anywhere I've coached, there are incredible people, but there was something, it's hard to describe, there was something very special about that place. Obviously what they had come through during the Troubles, ongoing social challenges, but the GA club was like an oasis in the desert. it was nearly a place where they found comfort and refuge, and they loved the GAA every bit as I loved it. But they loved it because they were where they were from, and they were so protective of each other, and they were so defensive of each other. It was unbelievable. So I had an incredible career. A 7-year-old, 6-year-old, remembering great down players and heroes, right to now been involved again with my own club and the committee, seeing how things have changed over the years, going to matches, past my 60th birthday last year, and imagine being able to say that you saw and played against Jack O'Shea, Mikey Sheehy, Ogie Moore, Bomber List, and Shawnee Walsh, all these great players, Jar Parr. I played against those people, played against Colin McIllarney, Mickey Cole, Peter Rooney when I was younger, and then you got to watch with no pressure. You got to watch the greats that we've had. So if you take Conor McManus, McCarthy, Fenton, Cluxton, Kilkenny, you get to watch these boys being about when Gooch was playing, Declan O'Sullivan was playing. Oh my God almighty, like I've been able, when I look back now, just incredible. And to top it all, I have 5 kids, and to see how successful they've been. So my girls play camogie for Clonduff and with Down, to see them win All Irelands, to see the boys play with Aidan's 40 this year, has played for Clonduff since he was 16 or 17. See Charlie and Ross is in Australia now, and to be about and witness all of those things, the GA has given me so much. It's been some trip. There's been heartbreak along the way, but not the heartbreak of winning or losing. It passes in a wee bit. That 91 squad, when we played along, in 1986, when we were playing in the Ulster Down, we were playing Tyrone, the Ulster final, there was a lad playing that day, Peter Walsh died a couple of years after that. In the 91 squad, Ambrose passed away, in the late 90s. In the mid 90s, we lost 2 young fellas from who I played with here at home, Collie Corn and Mark Mooney. And then recently, the Brannigan family here have lost 2 sons, both who played with Clonduff, and both who were very, very friendly with all the young fellas and girls around the club. And you add into that, Eamon Burns passed away in 2019, and the year before that, in 2018, Timmy Doyle, a really, really, really good friend of mine. You become very, I suppose, aware of your own mortality and the bubble that you live in as a youngster, and even when you're playing football, is burst by huge doses of realism and what life is at times. And you'll be just so thankful you're part of an organisation that gives you so much, and when the shit hits the fan, it's the first thing that surrounds you and nearly protects you as much as it can. So yeah, I've had some trip, and long may it continue, I hope.
And just before I let you go, Ross, I'm sure you're enjoying the football at the minute, and Down are certainly putting up big scores and everything else. But I'll just have to ask you about the rules before I let you go. What do you make of them so far?
I suppose the football that we watched for the last few years, I don't want to get caught up in showing what was the way I played and what's compared to now. Football evolves and changes every 10 or 15 years. What the powers felt that football had to change because it had become less attractive people can say it becomes more technical and more tactical, but the bottom line was that people decided it needed changed. It wasn't attractive enough, and a number of the rules have come in to try and make it more attractive. And there is no doubt that it has helped. The first couple of weeks has been great. I do think that there's some great rules. There are a couple of things that I'm not swung on, but only a couple. I don't like the fact that if someone is penalised and the ball is brought forward 50 yards, that it can then be taken back out outside of the 40 metre arc to allow an attempt for 2 points. I do think that if they're going to allow the keeper to move, and they talk about a 12v11, people have come up with these strap lines of 12v11, but there was always a +1 somewhere. You know, if an attacking wing back went forward and wasn't tracked, he was a +1. He was a 12v11 or 13v12, whatever it might be. But it would be easy to allow one of the 3 forwards to be able to track the goalkeeper, to allow that advantage, that +1 advantage, to be negated. I like the idea of keeping three up, but I do think at times if you're coming racing for a ball and you're just one step inside and momentum takes you across, it's a harsh penalty then to have to turn the ball over for a free. I think the biggest challenge will be the 50-metre disciplinary rule. There is absolutely no doubt that we need something. We're not good at keeping our mouths shut on the pitch. And sometimes I think the players aren't as bad as sidelines. I don't have a big problem with it. I think that the discipline of coaches along sidelines is shocking, and can, especially maybe not as much at the elite level as it is the lower level. But that's where my biggest question would be. Is I think the rules, with the amount of officials that they have in the county, can work fine. I'm not 100% sure how it's going to be managed in club football. But that, to me, now that's not to say it won't be. I'll hold judgment on it until then. But I would say yes. I think Jim Gavin and his team have gone into it with a very, very thorough approach. They've come up with the ideas. I don't like that we're already tearing them to pieces only a couple of weeks in. Let's get the league out of the way, see how they've gone for 2 months, and then ask there's nothing wrong to ask the team, are you happy with the way this has gone? Do you think anything could be modified or adjusted? Speak to referees, speak to coaches, but speak to them at club levels as opposed, because by the time March is over, National League's over, club leagues will begin, and so I'd say even at the end of May, have workshops with club referees, club coaches, and see how they're finding them, and then let it run for this year, and then make a judgment when it's over at the end of the year.
No, brilliant, Ross. Good man. Thanks very much for that. That was top class. Thanks for chatting to us.
All right, Sean. Thanks very much indeed.